So it's time to talk about sourdough discard. This is one of those things I feel like people get really excited about or they get really nervous about when they're getting started in sourdough baking. So what you see here is I have a jar of discard. So let's talk about first what sourdough discard actually is. So you saw the process of refreshing a starter, you saw what it looks like for a starter to be active. Well, just we talked about how there's a cycle where there's the yeast in here and the beneficial bacteria where they basically will eat and go through and change the dynamics of your flour and water. And that's why they create the bubbles and the beautiful active sourdough starter. But if that active sourdough starter is not used, what's going to happen is there's no way for these microbes to stop. They will continue doing what they were created to do. So the yeast will continue to break down and consume the carbohydrates in the bread flour. The bacteria will continue to break down that flour. And the more that they break it down, you'll see that there's a very runny consistency because all that gluten, where when we first mix a sourdough starter after we refreshed it, the feeding process, you notice it was really thick and sticky. And after it's broken down by sitting longer and letting them do more of their work, they basically cut apart so much of that gluten structure that it can no longer hold in any of those carbon dioxide bubbles. And so that's why you'll see the starter fall in volume and change in texture from being really fluffy and light, almost like a marshmallow fluff consistency in my opinion, to being like a ranch dressing consistency. So this is how it looks. I'm going to pour it out so you can see it in action. That this is how the starter looks when it's poured, whereas when it's active, it has this fluffy look. It almost floats on top of water like a cloud, whereas sourdough starter that's in that discard stage is so broken down. All the gluten structures are broken, and the population has continued to expand as well, that there's not enough food for those microbes. They're in a state where they're basically unhealthy. There's even some of the bacteria, some of the yeast are either unhealthy and less active or they've died. And so we need to clean this up by doing a refreshing process. So that's why I don't recommend using discard in bread recipes. There are special recipes where you can use discard, but it is not meant for using as a one-for-one in a traditional sourdough recipe, because your yeast are not at their healthy, active, vigorous stage, and the consistency is going to change the way that your dough ferments. And I often give the analogy, it may seem a little gross, but I think it's really helpful to think of this analogy of a pet. Now, we've talked about how a sourdough starter is a living thing, it's alive, and it needs care. So just like if you have animals or pets, you know that they need care. So they need to be fed, they need to have water, but part of their care is also the cleanup. And if we don't clean up after those animals, they have a really unhealthy environment, they can get sick. And the same is true for your sourdough starter. If we don't take out that excess waste, or we don't take part of it and transfer it and take care of that portion and make sure it's well fed and watered, if we let it just sit in here, it's going to continue in that state of not really the best health for making bread.